as most of you know here, that we have been reading for the last 5-6 months almost the seventh seminar of Jacques Lacan. It is the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, and in that seminar, he spent 2 chapters explicitly talking about the Das Ding. And can someone mute their mic, please?
Recording.
So basically, the goal is that all of that, which is very hard to understand in those early chapters, and we read through them, we discussed through them for hours, but it's not the clearest what the Das Ding is. And I'm going to try and approach it from both a theoretical perspective and a clinical perspective. So from the theoretical side, I'm going to be going straight into Freud's paper, The Project for Scientific Psychology, 1895, the classic paper which Lacan also cites. And on the clinical side, I'm going to be talking about trauma. Why Das Ding is central to trauma. And as you can see the title, it says the Freudian Das Ding, or why trauma is at the core of reading Freud. And what that basically means is that without putting trauma at the center, you cannot have an authentic reading of Freud, or more like an authentic Lacanian reading of Freud. Right. So we're going to do a lot of things, and one of those things is to redefine trauma. So compared to how the current neuroscientific and kind of EMDR approach to PTSD and other disorders, which looks at trauma in a different way. We're going to see why that is not the most useful way to look at trauma, and how Das Ding from Freud and Lacan can help us do better, hopefully. So I'm going to be starting with a quote from Rilke, the famous German poet. In one of his letters, he writes, how is it possible to live when the fundamental of things, our life, is so incomprehensible, when we're always inadequate in love, wavering in our determination, and impotent in the face of death? How is it possible to exist? He continues, I have not managed to conquer my amazement at the fact that for thousands of years humanity has been concerning itself with life and death, not to speak of God, yet even today, and for how much longer, stands in front of these primary, these immediate tasks, strictly speaking, the only ones we have, for what else can we do? So helplessly, so pitiably caught between terror and evasion, like the veriest beginners. My amazement over this fact, when I give way to it, drives me into the greatest confusion, and then into a sort of horror. But behind the horror, there is something else, something so immediate and yet transcending all immediacy, something so intense that I cannot decide with my feeling whether it be like fire or ice. So this whole feeling that Rilke is talking about is nothing else other than life. And as I go into the presentation, the heuristic I want to put into your head as you think about Das Ding is something that is very expanding, like life. You can't exactly pinpoint it. Right? Life is not just one event, one experience, or a memory. Life is a totality. But at the same time, it's not a totality of full goodness or something. It's a totality that also has horrific sides to it. It haunts you, right? So these are the 2 things that you should keep in your mind when you're first getting into Das Ding. The first is the totality, the fact that it's almost over-encompassing. And then the fact that this over-encompassingness also has a horrific aspect to it. It haunts the person. Just like here Rilke says, He is amazed by it, he is confused by it, but it also drives him into horror. So yeah, this horror and this immediacy is basically the eminent dusting that Rilke speaks of here. So going back to our main subject, that is psychoanalysis, right? We realize that the beginnings of psychoanalysis were not really as well defined as we would like to think, right? So psychoanalysis, both in its theory and practice, emerged out of its involvement with that which is traumatic. And that was for Freud, treating the hysterics, right? And before the hysterics, all Freud was doing was basically trying to make a name for himself across the neuroscientific and neurological literature. Right? He was trying to get published. He was trying to get a permanent position as a physician. And it is in his training times when he went to Charcot in Paris, and also after coming back, he realized that it is hysteria and the trauma that is related to hysteria that has a sort of mystery into it. And he tried to unravel the mystery, and it is through that unraveling of the mystery that we have today what we know as psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis started from understanding the traumatic, right? So trauma was the kernel of the discovery of the unconscious, right? And it's not just unconscious in the way we usually think about it. It's like, yeah, it's habits, you repeat it, and that's the unconscious. No, unconscious as something that has a traumatic aspect to it. So instead of thinking that trauma becomes unconscious, we should think that it is unconscious that itself is traumatic. And that's what Freud realized, that it's through trauma we can actually uncover what exactly this unconscious thing is, right? So usually in therapy, in psychotherapy, in behavioral therapies, um, in manuals, you can look this up in the DSM and the ICD. You see that trauma is always defined as a sort of distortion. It's something bad that happens to someone and it breaks the person. It's like, totally distorting the person, right? So it's like you assume that the person is actually complete and whole. He has a nice life. He goes and does his stuff, but then something happens and then it breaks the person, and that's trauma. It's like, something external, alien comes to you and totally shatters you, right? And it is an attack that debilitates and shatters, producing cracks in a surface that was plain. That's the usual understanding of trauma. And the way they try to back this up, like if you ask why exactly is trauma supposed to be this, then they try to explain through stressors, like what exactly gives stress to someone, and the biological reasons behind that. I don't really want to go into much of that because that will be a digression. But the core is that the neurobiology assumes that either you're genealogically disconfigured, like you have a genealogy that has trauma in it, or that something happened to you that caused the trauma, right? And this was not the way that trauma was always understood. This is the way trauma has been understood after post World War II, after the whole neuroscientific movement and all. But before that, before the whole the psychological movement, we had psychoanalysis to tell us what exactly this trauma is. And my point is basically is that what psychoanalysis gave as trauma is actually a better way to look at trauma than what we have today. So Das Ding, those who don't know the German, Das Ding just simply translates to the thing, is one of those concepts that had a subtle origin in Freud's work, which he himself went away from. Is like there is a discovery that a very profound person makes, and then he just walks away from the discovery, and unbeknownst to him if that discovery is actually useful or not. Dusting is one of those. Freud never gave a clear description of what the dusting is, and the place where he gave somewhat of a description, the project, he threw that away, and that's what we're going to start with. So this document, this paper, the Project for Scientific Psychology, which is in German also known as the Entwurf, the project, was published almost 11 years after Freud's death in 1950. And that's 55 years after its original inception. So it appeared in 1895. Freud died in 1939 to 1940. In 1950, it was recovered and published. And since then, it has been everyone who is interested in Freud in one way or another goes back to this text, right? So in this project, what is this project? The project that Freud tried to accomplish was that his approaches to hysteria, particularly to hysteria and moreover to the whole psychology of the mind, was not well regarded by the scientific community. The scientific community back then was heavily neurological. They used to not consider anything that did not have a strong neurological basis. And Freud, to make his concepts understandable and something that can be discussed, so that's the reason Freud wrote this thing, Project for Scientific Psychology. A previous name for this same work was called Psychology for Neurologists. So he was aiming to these people in the community who would rather discard him, and he wanted to make a place for his theory. But then he realized that much of what he's saying in the paper is actually very controversial. So he did not publish it. He just wrote it and never published it. So he tried to couch in neurological terms what he had been experimenting with the hysterics, right? So where do we begin with this text, right? So the project is quite a complicated text. It's a text that has a lot of neurology to it and some psychology to it. But we are going to be focusing on where Freud talks about trauma and where Freud talks about Das Ding. Okay? So just to recapitulate what I have been already saying, the traumatic kernel is the main point from which the discussion on Das Ding can start. And the traumatic kernel is basically that which is broken in human subjectivity from the beginning. So instead of considering trauma as something that is alien to us and externally thrusted upon us, it was Freud's move to find in trauma something that is at the core. So trauma isn't something that is happening to you externally and then it shatters you. Trauma is already there from the beginning. It just reappears in different ways. So it is not at the core as an abnormality, but as a beginning. And then, if you understand this move, then you're already criticizing much of contemporary psychology, because much of contemporary psychology is based on, you have trauma and this is how you should be, quote unquote, a normal person, and we're going to make you a normal person through these ways. But Freud's move was that there is no normality. Trauma is already at the core and it is the beginning. So you can say that we all start from an abnormal beginning. So there is no normal. There is no normative, uh, so to say, horizon to which we can come back. Right. So this traumatic kernel is a beginning that haunts us for the rest of our existence. So all that is haunting, all that is traumatic, actually goes back to this beginning. And this is the truth with a capital T that we arrive at when we reread Freud and his project. That's the main message. So where is the Das Ding? Well, the Das Ding is mentioned precisely 3 times in the project. He mentions it 3 times, and then afterwards he mentions it very like in a hand waving manner, right? But in the project he mentions it 3 times, and we're going to talk about some of those in detail. But the interesting thing is, Freud does not elaborate on Das Ding in any of the later works. And it's interesting why he did not do that, because if you think about it, if it's such an important move and if it's such an important thing that is already there from the beginning, he should have continued with it, right? But there are, like, my hypothesis as to why he did not continue it is again because one, it was controversial. You cannot do something like this with the contemporary neurology that he had at that time, and because he did not have a full-fledged psychoanalytic theory at that time. He just was starting out at 1895. So if Das Ding, because of its haunting and traumatic nature, is indeed at the kernel, why didn't Freud speak of it in detail? Like, and yeah, it's just one of those things that Freud developed as just an explanation that he never comes back to. And neither did any of the Freudians. So the first generation Freudians, the friends of Freud, the second generation of Freudians that got trained from the first generation Freudians, none of them talk about the Das Ding. Like several generations, you see nowhere Das Ding being brought up. And that's weird, because those people read Freud the closest, apparently, right? They read Freud in original German, and they were with Freud, and they never realized this. And this is where Lacan comes. And like as far as I understand from all that I've read in psychoanalysis, there is no one else before Lacan who emphasized on Das Ding more. Like there is no other Freudian, no other Kleinian, no British psychoanalyst, no American psychoanalyst who emphasized on the Das Ding. And the thing is, we can actually learn something from this approach that Lacan does, and this is why this slide is titled "A Lesson in Reading Freud," because the way Lacan approaches Das Ding and rereads Project is actually a lesson in how Freud should be read. And that's because, Lacan doesn't read Project in the usual manner, saying that, it's just some important things came from the paper, but it's mostly outdated neurology, and he was just applying, fringe psychology to neuroscience and all of that. But Lacan pays attention to the overarching goal of the project. And the goal was to provide a beginning to psychoanalysis, albeit in neurological terms. So, Lacan realizes that the potential of the project for scientific psychology lies in this particular concept. It is the Das Ding. And if you can take the Das Ding, which is this very, very small thing in the paper, and then you can realize the whole paper through that concept, then you can understand why Freud used it. And this is why Lacan has done it in several times. If you remember, how foreclosure came into existence in Lacan's work. Foreclosure is the the mechanism with which the psychotic relates to the symptoms, and that was never clearly written down by Freud. Lacan picked up a little thing, and with which he was able to read all that other people have read but missed. And I think it's an exercise that we should try whenever we're reading Freud. Is that don't get lost in trying to, you know, figure out, yeah, this Oedipus complex is particularly this or that. Try to understand what exactly is the goal of Freud, and in that goal, how these little things function. Just like in the overarching goal of putting down the foundations of psychoanalysis, Das Ding has an important goal. And of course, this is such a reading that Lacan always does in his uh, famous Return to Freud, right? So everything from the law of the signifier to foreclosures are not Lacanian innovations. They're simply elegant ways of reading Freud. And Das Ding is a product of such a reading. And I hope I made this clear because I don't know if one could take anything about Das Ding, which is so complicated, but I think one can take from this presentation about how to read Freud. Because again, just to explain another example, law of signifier was never present in Freud. It was present in structuralism, right? De Saussure, Roman Jacobson, all of those talk about signifier. But then Lacan read Freud's initial three publications, The Interpretation to Dreams, The Jokes and the Relationship to the Unconscious, and Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Those three texts, where signifier is never mentioned explicitly, but is always working in between the lines. When Freud is talking about jokes, why people laugh from jokes, and when Freud is talking about the transference in the dream from one symbol to another, it's exactly the signifier. So, in this way of trying to not just go with metaphors of what Freud is using in his work, but trying to understand the metonymic relationship, we can really radicalize Freud's original texts, and that's what's so fascinating about Lacan. That he could pull so much out of Freud, which no other Freudian realized. So that's enough about the Lacanian reading. We come back to Das Ding, right? So, as I said, Das Ding isn't something that can be easily traced down and defined in Freud. And even if you go back to Lacan, in his Écrits and in his seminars, it's very sporadic and discontinuous. In Écrits, it's mentioned about like 2 to 3 times in the whole of Écrits. Das Ding is mentioned. And in the seminars, I'm going to say this a bit later, but even in the seminars, after the seminar 7, Das Ding isn't mentioned again. And it's always interesting. It's like, Freud came to Das Ding and he wrote down the project and he never talked about it. Lacan came to Das Ding. He spoke about it in the seminar 7 and then never talked about it. And, as most of you all know, that Das Ding is also related to what we will later on talk about, the objet petit a, which was introduced in seminar 10 on anxiety. Even in that seminar, the Das Ding is mentioned only once. He never talked about why he came to objet petit a from Das Ding. And because of that sporadic nature, because the fact that Das Ding has this almost, zombie-like nature. It appears in different places, it appears in different forms. You're not really clear what exactly it is. Um, I try to trace it down, and this is what it looks like. If you look at the picture on the left, this is me preparing for the presentation. And you can see all sorts of things there. There's the project, there's the desire of the other, there's object petita, there's the primordial void. These are all names for the Das Ding. And it's related to everything, but at the same time present nowhere. No one talks about it in the clearest, detailed manner, except Lacan in Seventh Seminar, of course. So that's what we're going to get into. But yeah, that's me being paranoid about testing. So, continuing, what we realize is that Ding, even though Lacan tried to give it a psychological explanation from Freud, he also was influenced by a friend of his, Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, right? So Heidegger talked about Das Ding in his in a paper of his called Das Ding, and well, he gave a very different understanding of it. He did not give a psychological understanding, but the philosophical understanding was basically ontological, right? Talking about what is the primary object of experience. And even in that paper, Heidegger talked about how Das Ding can resemble like the Kantian thing in itself. So if people have read Kant, Kant talks about two types of things: there's the noumenon and the phenomenon. There's this noumenon, which is the thing in itself that you can never access. It's this transcendent, weird thing that is that is everywhere, but you can't access it. Humans can't access it. And even though the Freudian Das Ding might seem like that, it can seem like this transcendent thing that you can't access, but it's quite actually different. It's not an object of ontology. That's one thing to realize. Freudian Das Ding is not a philosophical object of ontology. It's fundamentally an other. And the other here, I mean in Lacanian sense, is the autre, right? Is someone else like me. Is another ego. Is my friend, the neighbor, someone else. It's another. Das Ding is basically something akin to that. It's fundamentally another. Right? So here I'm going to approach a word that Freud used in his project as a Nebenmensch, as the original neighbor, the original man, right? And what exactly is this original man, and why do we need it? We're talking about trauma, we're talking about horror, all of that. Where comes this Nebenmensch? Why do we need it? So to understand this, we realize that Das Ding is concerned with this other, but it's not like any other. It's not your friend, your neighbor, or anything. It's the other, but in a very primordial sense. When I say primordial, I mean the first sense of a human being. The first time you realize there is someone else other than you. And not just you realize there's someone else other than you realize that this person who is other than you is actually your first source of satisfaction. And this is why you, as you can already guess, that this Freudian Das Ding, as even Freud talks about in his project, that it relates to the child's wished object, the object that child wishes in his first initial stages of consciousness. And what are the memories and fantasies that are concerned around this child's wished object. But well, as you could guess, who would be the wished object for a child? Usually it is the mother or the person who is providing maternal care, right? Is the person who is giving food to the child, giving warmth to the child. That's the source of satisfaction. That's the wished object for the child. And here I'll quote Freud. Freud says in the project, quote, "Let us suppose that the object which furnishes the perception resembles the subject, a fellow human being." So here you can see when he says the perception resembles the subject, that's the other, someone else like me. I don't know exactly how he's like me, how she's like me, but resembles. There's some sort of resemblance, another fellow human being. Continuing, if so, the theoretical interest taken in it is also explained by the fact that an object like this was simultaneously the subject's first satisfying object and further his hostile one as well as his sole helping power. For this reason, it is in relation to another that a human being learns to cognize. So this quote, I want you to remember this quote for the rest of the presentation, if you can. Because in this quote, there's basically all the central tenets for what a dusting is. And if you've already known about dusting, you can probably trace them down. Subject's first satisfying object. Subjects and further his hostile one as well. It's the hostile object as well. But at the same time, it's the sole helping power as well. So this is the relationship that a human, a child, has to the dusting, and it's this another person that is so close to you, but at the same time is external to you. But at the same time, it's also the source of satisfaction. But at the same time, it's also the source of hostility. You see? So the object that resembles the subject is basically the child's mother, right? So Freud actually introduced this a few paragraphs before. But then you try to understand, then, is this Nebenmensch, this original neighbor, the original man, just the mother? Is everyone's mother their Das Ding? Is she the good, bad object that Klein considered, or the inseparable human being that Winnicott considered? Like both of these theorists, Klein and Winnicott, try to talk about the mother and the maternal figure in this way. Is Nebenmensch exactly that? Not quite it. So we realize that what the mother does here is not just be the mother, but she's the experience of the first human subject our child is introduced to. And I need you to pay attention to this because of course, it should be immediate to everyone that, yeah, your mother is the first person, the first human being that you understand. But at the same time, when you talk about this, you talk less about the first human subject and you talk more about the fact that they are your mother. And why does the first human subject has a primacy to it? Well, because it's the first time the child experiences something like himself that is external to it, right? Just as I said. So you try to, if you try to think through the Nebenmensch and the Das Ding, why do they relate and how do they relate? The basic idea is that when you're a child, you have this other, this Nebenmensch, the mother in most cases, who gives you your satisfaction, who gives you all sorts of care. But she also provides some hostility. Well, not intentionally, hopefully, but when she goes away and you have to cry, that's hostile. But this experience that the child goes through and the fantasies and the memories that are related to it creates a perception of an object. if not an object, is a perception itself. Just think about it. And this perception is the Das Ding. Das Ding is not the mother, neither the object. Is the object of perceived total satisfaction that never actually existed. And then you would say, well, the Nebenmensch did exist. The mother did exist. But the perception that the child had, which is of the total satisfaction that was caused by the Nebenmensch, does not exist. So you can think of it more like the child experiences mother, then he or she kind of fantasizes about getting total satisfaction from the mother. And this object of total satisfaction is the Das Ding. It never exists, but it exists only in the perception that was induced by the Nebenmensch. And because this Das Ding never existed, and because this Das Ding is the primary way in which the subject comes into existence, that's why we say a lot of the times in Lacanian theory and Lacanian analysis that the subject came into existence from a void. From a void where there was no object. And if I go back to the Freud quote, see the last line, Freud says, for this reason, it is in relation to another that a human being learns to cognize. And here, cognize can mean generally just the subject coming into existence. It's through the interaction with the Nebenmensch, with the mother, that you have the experience of Das Ding, which is basically a void, and it's through that the subject comes into existence. And this, in Freud, is precisely where we see something called creation ex nihilo. It's Latin, meaning creating out of nothing. Creation out of nothing. Right? And what this means is that the subject gets created out of literally nothing, out of an object that does not exist, which is the Das Ding. So, which we understood, right, is yes, the Nebenmensch is the perception, and then the perception leads to the subject's creation. All of that's fine. But where's the hostility? Well, I hinted at it first, right? But if you try to understand why does it have to be hostile? Why can't it be just all satisfaction? And you have a rosy creation ex nihilo. But as it turns out, there is no rosy creation ex nihilo. There is hostility from the beginning. Because we see that there's two things that's happening here with the situation that Freud's talking about. What happens is that there's a perception that does not coincide with the child's wish. The child wishes to be taken care of, or the child wishes to be fed. And this perception does not coincide with that wish. That's the first thing. And then there's the second thing, which is that the infant wishes with all his heart to recognize this image so that it might find the longed for image through this. So what happens is that as the child experiences another person, right, it wishes all sorts of satisfaction from that person or that other. And then there's this perception that doesn't coincide with that wish. Maybe the child thinks that the mother is too bad. There's no milk. There's no food. And this perception doesn't coincide with the child's wish. That's like the child going through an existential crisis. The child's whole existence now is broken because the perception of the person who was supposed to give all sorts of satisfaction doesn't actually get to my wishes. That's the first, there's a crack. The second crack, which is much deeper, is that the perception that the child has is an image, right? There's an image of a person, what Jung would call imago, right? or the Kleinians would call the internal objects, right? This image that this child has of the person, the child very, very strongly wishes that this image should be equal to the longed for image. And the longed for image is the primordial other, right? Is the primordial other at the beginning of child's consciousness, which has all the satisfaction, right? So what happens is that the child doesn't just have a problem with perception and wishes. The child has a problem with the image and another image that he had, right? So the child wishes that it is through this image, the image that I have now of some person, through this image, somehow I can get to the longed for image, the primordial image, right? So the child is always kind of, trying to return back to this wholesome state, right? To this wholesome image that it used to have, but now it doesn't, right? And that's basically Freud's explanation of how thought is set into motion and how from then on desire comes into being. If you read these paragraphs in the project very diligently, you'd be able to realize that Freud is not just explaining, yeah, this is why the child cries. Freud says that because this happens, because these two things happen, that's the beginning of thought for the child. This is how Freud says that child comes to cognize. That's why that quote in the last sentence was exactly this. The child learns to cognize because there's two types of failures that happens in the beginning. And when thought comes into existence, and through this sort of say a broken beginning, desire also comes into existence. The child wishes for something that he can't have because it never existed. And for those who might have read the fifth seminar of Lacan, where he gives account for the graph of desire, I think there he refers to this. So, if you try to think about this, how radical this is, that the beginning of the human subject is formed out of two central failures. And Lacan says exactly this in his Seminar 7. Lacan says that the world of our experience, the Freudian world, assumes that it is this object, das Ding, as the absolute other of the subject that one is supposed to find again. It is supposed to be found at the most as something missed. One doesn't find it, but only in its pleasurable associations. So you can only sort of say find the traces that are left of das Ding. Right? Some traces, some pleasurable associations that are left of das Ding, and you can try to kind of like a detective, try to find where it leads to, the footprints. But the footprints never lead to anything. They're just footprints. That's the das Ding. And I hope now it is clear why das Ding has this elusive kind of aspect to it, right? Because not only is it the reason why we start from a failure, but it is also the reason why we can never go back to a beginning. The more you try to go back, the more you come back to the same place. And now, just to go back to that same quote of Lacan, I just look at this particular phrase, the absolute other of the subject. And here, if you note, the absolute other here is not the little o, is the capital O. Why would Lacan say that? And what does he mean by the absolute big other of the subject? Well, um, let's find out. So, as we all know, the big other in Lacan is a complicated thing, but in simple terms, Lacan's big other is the otherness that goes beyond imaginary relations, right? So when I talked about the little other, I'm talking about the egos, the people you see, someone like me. That's imaginary relation. But the big other goes beyond all imaginary relation. It constitutes um, the subjectivity, right? So not only does it constitute the subjectivity, it is the place where speech is constituted. And well, it's the big other in itself is a complicated thing to go into. But just think about big other as this place where the subject needs to refer to, even if it doesn't exist. Like, as we know in Lacan, the big other never exists. But it must not exist because its semblance of existence is necessary for the subject, right? Even if it doesn't exist, the subject needs to point to it for its own existence, right? Just like the Das Ding, if you realize, Das Ding doesn't exist. The the all good and the primordial object doesn't exist, but the subject needs to find it, and it's in finding that which does not exist that subjectivity appears. Just like just like the big other. The big other doesn't exist, but you need to kind of look for it. At least act as if you're looking for it. Right. But if you look at the title of the slide, I said the screaming other of the subject, the big other of the subject. Why do I say that? And here we have to go back to the project of Freud again, where Freud talks about the screaming of the child when the child is shouting and screaming. So, what I want you to think about when the phrase absolute other of the subject comes is that there is something that is very close to you, which constitutes you, but at the same time, it is all that is external as well. And it's difficult, I know, it's weird, but the absolute other basically means that in the subject there exists something that is very transcendent to it. The subject assumes that there is something transcendent in it, even though there is nothing, right? And just to make it clear, we go back to Freud. Right? So Freud says, when otherwise, owing to pain, one has received no good indication of the quality of the object, the information of one's own scream serves to characterize the object. And I want you to pay attention to this sentence, this phrase, the last part of the sentence where he says, the information of one's own scream. What is the information of one's own scream? It's your own scream coming back to you. You being aware at some level that you're screaming. And it is through the information of your own scream that you characterize the object. What is the object? Well, it's the object that the child wishes. It's what the child assumes, that if he had that object, he would not be crying anymore. Right? And this is why there's a sort of similarity between that which is uncanny and the Das Ding. And I'm going to talk a bit about it because if you think about it, the idea of the absolute other of the subject and the fact that your own scream gives you the idea of the object, or that it characterizes the object. It means that there is something that is externally intimate to you. Um, Lacan uses um, this word called extimate. Extimate translates to English and extimacy. It's something external that is very, very intimate to you. Right? And why is that external and intimate at the same time? Well, let's see. So the Nebenmensch is the capital O, other of the subject. It's the capital O of the subject because at that time the child can only constitute its subjectivity in relation to that particular being. Without that being, there is no thought, there is no desire, there is no subjectivity. Right? But at the same time, because that Nebenmensch is the other as an external, at the same time, it's very intimate as well. It's this intimate relationship between the child and the mother, right? And that is, so to say, the uncanniness between it. Because if you've read the uncanny paper of Freud says that etymologically there is a similarity between heimlich and unheimlich. Heimlich from German means homely, unheimlich from German means unhomely. And Freud realized that people use those two things actually in the same way. They act as if they use it in the same way. People, when describing something horrific, say always that it's use the word heimlich to denote that it's horrific, but it's also something that is close to us. And similarly, when they're talking about something that is unheimlich, that is unhomely, uncomfortable, they're talking about something that is very close to them. Right? So, just to help you understand, if you have seen any ghost shows, the ghost is always someone who is very close to the family. Right? Either the ghost is close to the family or it is close to the home in which the family resides, right? So Freud realized that most of the time that which is unheimlich, which is unhomely, is actually found in your home. So that which is most uncanny is actually near you, not external to you. And that also helps me to explain why I'm trying to explain trauma in this reversal way. Why I'm trying to say that trauma doesn't happen externally, but it already is there from the beginning. That's one of the ways. So just to continue, that which is uncanny actually is very close to us, as Freud concludes. What haunts us isn't alien to us. It's actually very similar to us and something that has been from a long time, a primordial thing. This uncanniness is what makes dusting not only closer, but actually the center of the real. What do I mean by this? Well, when Freud talked about uncanny, Freud said that this is a moment when the subject is kind of, in this state of horror, but at the same time, comfort. And if you still remember the Rilke quote that I put in the beginning, Rilke was confused, horrified, but at the same time felt some sort of comfort in it. And the comfort is the fact that it is very close to you. It's not comfort in the sense that you're feeling good, but it's the fact that you know that it's close to you. And the fact that you know it's close to you is also something that is horrific. And this uncanniness characterizes dusting. Dusting always is that which is primordially the closest, but at the same time primordially the most horrific. And this is what the Lacanian real is about. Lacanian real isn't this, outer existing weird, like Kantian noumenon that exists and just, you can't access it. The real is actually very personal. to you. And it's not personal because it has some personal content inside it, like the symbolic has personal content. It has, your relationships, how you understand certain things or not. But the real doesn't have that. But because it doesn't have that, it is also like literally the closest to you. And because das Ding is the uncanniness in its extreme form, um, it is the center of the real that makes the whole thing uncanny. So, if you've ever heard about the real, it appears always as something that is horrific. It's uncanny, right? As Lacan says, or even Zizek says sometimes, it almost comes to you as a trauma, as an event, right? And why does it feel uncanny? That's because Das Ding is the center of the real. And to show you that Das Ding indeed has this attitude of being close to you, but at the same time being horrific and like like basically debilitating you. I'm going to take a clip from David Lynch's Lost Highway. If you have watched the movie, then spoilers. But if you haven't, then fasten your seatbelts. Notice how the sound faded.
We've met before, haven't we? I don't think so. Where was it you think we met? At your house, don't you remember? No, I don't. Are you sure? Of course. As a matter of fact, I'm there right now. What do you mean you're where right now? At your house. That's fucking crazy, man. Call me. Dial your number. Go ahead. I told you I was here. How'd you do that? Ask me. How'd you get inside my house? You invited me. It is not my custom to go where I'm not wanted. Who are you? Give me back my phone. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
So you must have noticed how Lynch faded the music, the background music, as the guy came in. And we'll call that guy the mystery man because he is the mysterious man. And just as when he came, you can see that, his face, of course, is like weird. Right? He almost looks like an alien, not a human. And then he comes to this person and says that we've met and I'm at your house. And just when, he has this process of, making him call, talking to him from his house, even though he is here, our protagonist feels a sort of threat. He almost is like totally lost what exactly is happening to him, right? And if you've watched the movie, and if you haven't, this guy actually sticks there from the beginning to the end. He's there until the very last scene. And he is someone that this person, the protagonist, can never make sense of. He can't. But yet, he's there and he appears as someone who knows the protagonist very well. And like, he goes to their home and all. But the protagonist is lost. He doesn't know how this person has access to all of this. And this is what I mean, and this is what Lacan means by extimité and extimacy. It's someone who appears to be very, very close to you, right? Like lives in your house, knows everything about you, all the nasty details, at the same time is external. And this is what also Freud said about the neighbor in Civilization and Its Discontents. The neighbor is this person who lives so close to me, he must have heard me as I rage and as I get angry and all. But at the same time, he's totally external to me. He knows these little details that nobody else probably knows, just like this person. So when something like this appears, what happens to the subject is then reminded of its, so to say, cracks. The fact that it is not unified, the fact that it is not always homely, the fact that in the subject there is a big other, the absolute other. And this guy, the mysterious man, is basically the representation of that absolute other. Yeah, so that was Lynch about Das Ding. We shall continue with the presentation. So, now that I have given you a pretty good idea about the central ideas, of Das Ding, about the fact that it is related to the Nebenmensch, the fact that it is uncanny, and the fact that it has this extimate nature. Right? So here we're going to see all of that in action with the case that Freud talked about in his project, the case of Emma. Right? This case is not present anywhere else, even though. So this is another interesting thing about Freud's writing, that Freud published in the same year that a project was written, the case studies on hysteria, right? The studies on hysteria. Freud published that, but Freud did not include this case. Probably because Freud did not want anything from this document, the project, to go into other publications. But anyways, so we try to understand what happened to Emma, and how can that shed light on Das Ding. So I'm going to quote from Freud about a brief history of the Emma case. So Emma is at present time to compulsion of not being able to go into shops alone. So at present time she can't go to shops alone. And as a reason for this, she produced a memory from the time when she was 12 years old, shortly after puberty. She went into a shop to buy something, saw the two shop assistants, one of whom she can remember laughing together, and ran away in some kind of affect of fright. In connection with this, she was led to recall that the two of them were laughing at her clothes and that one of them had pleased her sexually. That's that's mostly what we know about Emma. But what happened is that after Emma came to Freud to talk about her problems with regards to not being able to go to shops alone, she realized that there's another memory apart from what happened to her at the shop where the shopkeepers were laughing. And in this memory, she had gone to a shop to buy some candy, and the shopkeeper had actually grabbed at her genitals through her clothes. And in other words, basically abused Emma, right? This is what Emma remembered after after a few times talking to Freud, and this event was actually 4 years before the first event that she talked about. Right? And you might think that there's something weird about this, like if something like this had already happened to her 4 years earlier, wouldn't she remember that first, and then that would have caused what happened later on? And you know, if she had this happen to her, why didn't she first broke down into agoraphobia or something like that? Like, why didn't she develop symptoms of fright from shops after the first event? Like, how could she go into a shop 4 years afterwards? Right? So there's something happening at the level of memories with regards to uh, the symptoms and the symptom formation that happened with Emma. So this is the famous diagram that Freud gave in Project for Scientific Psychology. This diagram depicts basically what happened to Emma. Right? So I'm gonna go deeper into what this diagram means and all the little things about Emma. But I guess I can take a break, and if anyone has any questions, I can answer them. Or if you all want me to continue, I can just continue.
Yeah. How much do you think the presentation is going to take?
At most 30 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we can maybe make a short pause if someone has a question.
Yep.
But anyway, if no one has question, we might make just a short pause, just to let you some time to rest before continuing. I think we might uh, finish with the presentation, anyways, and we might have not so much large opportunity, but an opportunity indeed to at some point or to get to give some feedback on the presentation, or maybe relating to the points we have been discussing through the seminar.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the presentation's really great so far.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then I'll drink some water and I will continue with the case of Emma. What happened to her? Okay, so as you can see, this is the diagram. Go ahead. Sorry, you have something?
Sorry, it was on my side, but
I
I
see.
did not have to say anything. Sorry.
So we're going to learn a lot of things from this case. Okay, this case has a lot to it. But one thing that we can start with is how neurosis in general functions, how neurosis in the Freudian sense functions, and how the theory of the unconscious in Freud came about. So what happened with Emma is that she first had an experience of sexual assault from the shopkeeper. Right? But remember, she was before puberty at that time. She did not have puberty, or like it was the onset of puberty at that time. But I think from what I remember, like the puberty had not come. So what happened is that the sexual experience, which was the first sexual experience for Emma, was not able to sort of symbolize itself until she hit puberty. Okay, so what happened with the shopkeeper did not sort of realize itself. She was traumatized for sure, but like most things in trauma, you can't make sense of it, right? And she was not able to make sense of it even physically, right? So until she hit the puberty, which was about like 4 years after, then when this scene happened again, and it didn't happen exactly the same, because the shopkeepers are not like assaulting her in the same way, but they laughed at her, and that kind of made her recount the earlier memory, which then led to a um, proper traumatic response, right? And that's the general outlook you should try to keep in mind. That this is how it happened, and this is why Emma responded in this manner. But if you look at this diagram, right? So you have the shop assistants here; they are laughing, and those three things are connected, right? So these two things are what happened the latest, right? So before that, as she remembers, that's why Freud does it below, because this was the first memory, and then this was the memory that got triggered as she remembered this. So in this older memory, you have the shopkeeper, and then the clothes, and then the assault, right? So these three things together represent what exactly happened to her, right? And this assault led to a sexual release, and this sexual release led to all sorts of symptoms, which is flight, being afraid of the shop, and being alone. Okay? All of these three things get formulated after the sexual release. Now, what does the sexual release mean? Right. So what happened is that the original assault was deeply repressed. Right. The original assault did not get to be realized, but what left was what I would like to say a kernel of the traumatic experience in a representation. So this is what Lacan said: a kernel, or so to say, a piece of it is left in the Verstellungen. And the Verstellungen here is the cloth. So in the cloth, something was left from, it's like a trace, just like in the footprints we were talking about the dusting. The trace was left in the clothes from the first assault. And when the shop assistants started laughing, looking at the clothes of the girl, she kind of recounted. I mean, she didn't literally recount, but it's more like she experienced that trauma 4 years after in this stage, right? So this whole complex, the complex concerning all the sexual stuff, all the memories and fantasies about the shopkeeper and what happened, all of them are circling around the clothes, or the idea of clothes, more like the representation of clothes they was telling them. So this phobia of the shop that happens has two stages, right? But these two stages actually help us uncover something much more important, is that the symbolic substitution helps us understand how the symptom is produced. And the symbolic substitution, when I say the symbolic substitution, is basically what gets substituted for clothes, the idea of clothes. It doesn't happen just once, it happens twice. First, when she was touched, groped by the shopkeeper, that gave an idea of the clothes. And then when the shop assistant started laughing at her clothes, that gave another idea of the clothes. And through these ideas, that the symptom was produced. But Freud doesn't stop there. Freud just doesn't say, yeah, it's the two things that help us explain how the symptom is produced. But there's something more crucial. It's what I hinted at earlier on, is the onset of sexuality. So sexual experiences, as Freud has already noted in his 3 essays on sexuality, that you can have polymorphous, perverse sexual experiences as a child, but the moment, the place where the sexual experiences are, so to say, symbolized or understandable is only at puberty. It's only at puberty that that the sexual experiences are centered, and the subject experiences all those things not as something that just happened once. It's like the child was abused as a child, and like it just happened once, but rather as the puberty comes, due to sexual maturation, the child feels all sorts of things that it felt once when they were abused. So Freud explains that here the trauma is not attached to like the thing is, you would think, what is the cause of the trauma? Well, the cause of the trauma is this shopkeeper, right? Yeah, the shopkeeper is the traumatic person who does all sorts of things, and those sorts of things have traumatized me. So the shopkeeper must be the traumatic person. But Freud says that that's not exactly true. So Freud says that because the symptom formation happened in these two stages and related to the memories, and the memories unfolded in this peculiar manner, the traumatic potential is not attached to a perception, like the perception of the shopkeeper, but to a memory. And the memory is not something that is, so to say, maybe accurate, but the memory is basically the trace of what was left in the clothes from that event. So it's like, something happens to you, you can't remember the total event, but because it happened to you at a particular part of your body, like the memory is attached or localized in that part of the body, and it happens the most in hysteria or conversional disorders, right? And here it is close. So in the guise of a memory, things related to these clothes were centered in Emma 4 years ago, and that memory got unraveled when she started remembering about this later experience. So, you have to realize that because Emma was sexually more mature and had crossed puberty or was at the onset of puberty, now sexuality was not just something that was externally happening to you. You were feeling things on your own, which were once caused by this person. So you see, the realization that you had felt something externally to you, and now the same thing is coming internally from you, is haunting. That's traumatic. The fact that I can feel sexual is traumatic to me because I've been traumatized by the sexual abuse. And now the fact that I feel these things, which I now feel, can mean like somehow there is something inside me which can destroy me, right? Or something from that event that is left inside me. And this is why hysterics can feel this urge to kind of get out of their body. They almost want to fight their body and get out of there. It's because they feel that something from that event is stuck inside their body, right? So this is what Freud says as the difference between the primary process and the secondary process. And I hope if everyone does not know this, they should, that the first event that happened is basically the primary process. It's not repression proper, but it just happens, and the subject can't symbolize it. And when the subject does symbolize it, then the subject has to repress it by displacing the signifiers. And this is what we in Lacanian, when Lacanian theory known as the first lie, the primary lie. It's the first lie that tries to hide the primary experience. Right? Freud also talked about this as the screen memory. You're so traumatized by something that you create another memory just to hide the trauma. Right? And all this, I hope, is making sense in relation to Das Ding, because Das Ding is exactly this: is the experience of the closest, the intimate, being externally haunting. It's almost like that which used to be externally haunting is now inside me. And that's why hysterics sometimes usually, and not just usually, there's a history of hysterics being confused as being possessed. And the church used to perform exorcism on them just to remove the soul and the devil out of them. And because that's what it almost feels like. It feels like that which is alien is now inside you. And boy, that's horrific. So yeah, that was what happened with Emma. The primary defense was to just forget that experience, and when puberty came in, the experience got symbolized, materialized, and now the trauma is, which was already there, got sort of say a language of its own, because now the subject also experiences sexuality in a different way. So you can see that, another thing that this Das Ding, or in this case of Emma, suggests is that the sexual experience in the other, in the shopkeeper, in someone else external to you, is inherently a constitutive experience. This constitutes your subjectivity. So there's a famous line that Lacan says in the seventh seminar. We have read through this, where he says that the Das Ding is a primordial function which is located at the level of the initial establishment of the gravitation of the unconscious Verstanden. The unconscious representations, they all gravitate toward an originary, so to say, a function, a primordial function. And this primordial function is the Das Ding, is the place where we first encountered the desire of the other. The fact that not only can you be desired by the other, but that there exists a desire of the other for you. Right? And this is also the encounter with the real. Trauma of the Emma was the encounter with the real. But then the good question is, when did Emma encounter the real? Was it in the second instance or in the first instance? In the first instance, right? Because in the second instance, you have the symbolic doing its job. It's in the first instance that Emma encountered the real in its horrific manner, and it made her ask all sorts of things unconsciously about who is this guy and what does he want? Why is he doing all of these things? Right? And this, what Freud called as the germ of hysteria, because every case of hysteria, without a doubt, has something like this, where the first traumatic experience doesn't symbolize itself, and when it does symbolize, you realize it has led to symptom formation. So it's all of these things. The fact that the human subject has to deal with this desire of the other. The fact that even before you're born, there exist these people who think all sorts of things about you. This big other, which is basically the symbolic order, right? All of that is traumatic to the subject. And unless one can symbolize it, unless one can find a language for it, you're always going to be haunted by it. Right? And that's why the real resists all sorts of symbolizations. And that's the definition of real. It's that which resists symbolization. And that's why it's also traumatic. And that's why it's also the home of Das Ding. So moving away from the Emma case, I hope that was enlightening about Das Ding. We're just going to talk about a few things related to the Das Ding, which come from the Emma case as well. And Lacan talks about this a bit. Because we've already said how the other is traumatizing, how there's the horrific side and all of that, and then there's the Nebenmensch. But there is this otherness of the other as well. It might sound a bit a mouthful and weird, but the other also has an other, and both of them are big others. So Lacan doesn't just agree with Freud on the etiology of hysteria and its relationship to biological maturation, but takes a step further, and he sees that this is an explication of something much more general, or I should say, much more structural. It is the dependence of human beings on the other as a place to confide in, and how this place in which the human being confides in is also the source of hostility. And that's what happened with Emma as well. Emma, which, like all children, had their experiences with their mother, the Nebenmensch, and when the first encounter that, yeah, this is who I am, they're thrown into the symbolic world, given a name which is not theirs, and all of that. And then they sort of say, believe in it, and then something happens which shows that this is inherently hostile. That basically cracks open the fact that how much the human being depends on the big other. And that's why big other in Lacan and all those who use Lacanian theory talk about the big other as the God, right? As the God, because that's what humans depend on for their existence. And that's more or less all the theoretical stuff I had to say about Dasding. I'm just going to talk a bit more about some interesting details. As I said earlier, Dasding is sporadic and unclear in Lacan's and Freud's offer. Lacan only talks about it in the Seminar 7. And in his article, Lacan and the Thing, Facinelli says, this thing, when it appears first in Lacan's Seminar, is like a meteor vaulting across the sky. And like a meteor, it largely dissolves in the Seminar, leaving behind some invisible matter which will be present in all of his latter work. And this makes sense. If you try to think about, what happened to Dasding after the Seminar 7th, you realize that Dasding is present in one or another way in much of Lacan's late stuff. And even though it isn't appearing explicitly as Dasding, and we'll talk about that, but it is nonetheless present. And I love this metaphor, to be honest, like the fact that this meteor comes and crashes in the Seminar 7 and gets dissolved in all Lacanian theory is just wonderful. So one of the things that happens to Dasding after Seminar 7 is that it gets turned into Objet Petit A. Now what exactly is Objet Petit A, and like, how does it differ from Dasding? This is one of the major questions, right? So this invisible matter that dissolved into Lacan's work reappeared again in one form, which was Objet Petit A in the Seminar 10. Right? So Dasding, which was unthinkable, inherently traumatic, a horizon that subject wanted to go back to but was haunted from, can't go back to, all of that which characterized Dasding. Now, if you sort of say give it a symbolic reconfiguration, or so it's called, a symbolic circuit, which has no imaginary relations. It is not related to any Nebenmensch. It is not related to the mother or anything. But you give it what Facinelli says, the symbolic circuit, then what you get is the object petita. So it is through the object petita that lack is represented as constitutive of desire. What do I mean? It means that the traumatic horizon, the unthinkable horizon, now can be symbolized. How can it be symbolized? Well, it can be symbolized because now we center lack in all things. Before seminar 10, before Object Petita, lack was not. I wouldn't say lack was totally symbolized, because to symbolize lack, you need that which fills the lack, and that which fills the lack is the Object Petita. And because of this lack, you have the desire. And it makes sense, right? Because if you go back, if you remember back when I told you the Freudian conception of how desire came into being, it was because of the Das Ding. Because of how Das Ding, through these failures, leads to thought and then desire. But then, if you want to do that better without just having this over-encompassing thing called Das Ding, you symbolize it. You symbolize it by centering Lacan, that was a slip, centering lack into all things. And that's why Object Petita was introduced. And because lack is now constitutive of desire and it is introduced and centered, that's why the subject is no longer terrified by the answer to the question, the fundamental question. Que voi? What do you want? Right? What is your desire? What do you want? And if you think about it, Das Ding, along with the Nebenmensch, also had a primary form of this question of what do you want? The question that must have come in the mind of Emma when the first event happened. When the first event happened, it was the encounter with the real, where she must have been terrified and she must have been asking, what exactly does this shopkeeper want? Which is again the encounter with the desire of the other. And now all of that can be spoken in clearer ways, just if you have Object Petita. So one way of looking at the difference between Object Petita and Das Ding is that Object Petita symbolizes that which was only traumatic, which was the Das Ding. Right, so basically what I was telling you about is the fact that the Object Petita symbolized what was this all-encompassing thing in Das Ding. And, a metaphor that helps me, and it has been used in some ways, Zizek calls Das Ding the black hole in the subject. It's like, it's this black hole around which, because the black hole has no mass at the center, and around it there's a lot of mass. And to use that metaphor, the mass that's around that is basically the Verstellungen that Lacan talked about. And this black hole inside the subject is what is responsible for all that is hostile and all of that. All of that what we saw. But Object Petita, if you were to use a metaphor, is basically a star. If not a star, it's like this light that is sort of say covering the center of the black hole. It's like, there is the black hole that is behind the cover. And Object Petita basically symbolizes it. It's like, you're no longer just looking at a void, a nothing, but there is something. And we know that, yeah, this something is, evasive, elusive, fading, and all of that, but it's still something. And that's why, object always appears in different ways. It appears as the next car you want, as this, this girl that you've been interested in, or the fact that you feel, if only you had that mobile phone, you'd be working very, very productively. It's that which promises to fill the lack, promises to answer the question of dusting, and remove all the hostility, remove all the traumatizing. That's what object promises on the surface. But the concept of object itself tells us, because of its partial and evasive nature, it can never answer that. So it basically makes life more tolerable. It's like, you have an illusion about, having this thing, you can't have it, of course you can have it. But the fact that now you know that you can have it, or there is an kind of consciousness about the lack, to some extent, that makes it bearable than the void. So just to end, before we are back to trauma, we're back to the fact that regardless of whether you have the object petit or whether you have the dusting, you're constantly frightened by the traumatic thing, right? And not only that, we have a good redefinition of trauma. So instead of supposing that there's this unified subject that got split by some encounter, to say that Emma was a very nice child, the first thing that happened, she got sexually assaulted, and then she got traumatic. That's not trauma. Like that's not trauma for Freud. For Freud, the trauma is an encounter with the dusting, but it is nothing external. It's something which is within the subject's own being. And that's the unknowable part of the subject's being. And hysterics, as I said repeatedly, exemplify this. Hysterics know that that this is one of the differences between the hysteric and the obsessional. The hysteric is well aware that the master is not a true master, and that's only because she is aware of her own void and that unknowable thing. And all of these hysteric symptoms are not the causes of this external master. The external master only causes to form the symptoms. But the beginning of why the hysteric falls into this process is because of this traumatic encounter. So the hysteric is actually very terrified, the most terrified of herself, of her own being, the fact that she doesn't know who she is for the other person, right? So just that being, we can conclude that trauma is no longer an external phenomenon, but an origin story of the subject. And just to end with a nice quote, which shows how human beings are the result of trauma, I'm going to quote this from a collection called After Lacan, Clinical Practice and the Subject of the Unconscious. The quote is, "Human being is indeed the result of trauma, namely the irreversible and traumatic diverting of the instinctual functioning and of the neurophysiology of the organism that is affected by language. Language, when it traverses the human being, excludes a certain jouissance, whose knowledge or savoir is carried by the instincts, and which Freud called das Ding, and Lacan the primordial real." And with that, I'm done.